There's a lot of law out there that even though it just doesn't say hospitality on it or hotel on it, that you need to be mindful of from a compliance perspective to protect your assets and, and to operate in a fair, friendly, empathic way.
This episode is brought to you by Reliance Hospitality Global, where hospitality meets strategy. Whether you're developing your next hotel, need help navigating operations, or you're looking to increase profitability through our expert consulting and business process outsourcing services, Reliance has you covered. From boutique independents to full-service brands, we help owners, investors, and partners unlock value at every stage. Visit RelianceHospitality.com to learn more, and let's build something remarkable together.
Welcome back, everyone, to this week's episode of Check-In with Bryan. I'm your host, Bryan Fish. And, there is an old saying in aviation that you don't judge a pilot by how they fly in clear skies. You judge them by how they land the plane when the engine cuts out. And I've been thinking a lot this week about the idea of control. In our industry, in hospitality, we are obsessed with control. We script the arrival experience, we standardize the thread counts, we time the appetizers. We build entire brands around the promise of consistency. But the truth is, your brand isn't defined by the 99 days that go exactly according to the SOP. Your brand is defined by the one day that doesn't. There is a moment in every crisis, whether it's a pipe bursting in the lobby, a PR nightmare, or a massive partner failure, where the incident stops being the story, and your reaction, that becomes the story. We often think the damage comes from the event itself, but I would argue that in the court of public opinion, forgiveness is usually available for the mistake. People understand that things break, vendors fail, systems crash. What people do not forgive is indifference. They don't forgive confusion, and they certainly don't forgive a lack of empathy. The brands that survive and even thrive after a disaster are the ones that stop worrying about whose fault is this and start obsessing over how do we fix this. They realize that while they couldn't control the lightning strike, they have absolute 100% control over whether they hand the guest an umbrella or tell them to stand in the rain. So, as we head into today's conversation, I want you to think about your own businesses, not about your crisis manual or your legal indemnification clauses. We'll get into those. I want you to think about your reflex when the uncontrollable happens. Is your brand's first instinct to protect the contract, or is it to protect the human being that's being affected? Because that reflex, that is what determines if you're just a business that had a bad day or a brand that truly understands what hospitality means. Remember, hospitality is something that can be delivered in any business vertical, not just hotels and restaurants. Do you want to be the business that is remembered for how well customers were treated in a crisis? Or do you want to be remembered as the business that said, thank you for your money, now go pound sand? I think most of you know which you would pick. So why would you even consider the one that is sure to leave a bad mark on your reputation? We have a lot to unpack today. Our guest today is a leading voice in the world of hospitality, law, and leadership. Stephen Barth is the founder of HospitalityLawyer.com and a tenured professor at the University of Houston's Conrad and Hilton College, where he has spent over 3 decades teaching the next generation of industry leaders. As an attorney and sought-after keynote speaker, Stephen is known for his laugh-to-learn approach, helping audiences navigate complex topics like legal risk, crisis management, and emotional intelligence. He is the author of the widely used textbook, Hospitality Law, as well as the book Intelligent Emotions, on self-responsibility, owning our emotional power, and changing our reactions. Recognized as one of the world's top 30 hospitality professionals by global gurus, he joins us today to share his insights on leadership and the legal landscape of our industry. It's an honor and a privilege to say, welcome to the show, Stephen. And we are so happy to have you. I've been wanting you on since we met back at AHOA earlier this year, which seems like 2 years ago at this point. There's been so much that's happened this year.
Well, thanks for having me. And it does seem like a long time ago, doesn't it? Yeah, and already gearing up potentially for next year. But yeah, pleasure to be here. It's nice to get your note. And yes, to your point, a lot going on. And it's a perfect observational opportunity around your customer care. And I agree with you wholeheartedly how those are the moments when people can shine,
Yeah.
particularly in hospitality. Yeah.
No, 100%. And I think I don't know, and I think you may, because I'm sure you have peers that work in other types of law and have different types of
Sure.
clients. I do feel it's interesting depending upon what happens in a hotel. I always said I like the hotels because we operate in the gray a lot of times, but there's certain things that happen that people are like, oh, we can't do this because we're going to be sued, or they bring
Yeah.
some sort of like, bring some sort of legality into it where I do then find it's like, okay, is that really actually going to be what happens, or are we going, or will you get sued because you weren't empathetic to the guests? Like,
There's a, I think you make a fair point. I've always thought that if we treat somebody like a liability claim, that's what we're going to end up with. You know, if you couple that with the concept that people are normal until they check into a hotel, you know, you can kind of understand why challenges arise in hotels.
right. Yeah. No, 100%. Because it's one of those things where you just look at it and I think that people make their own disasters
Oh yeah,
themselves. And
yeah, on both sides. You know,
on both
customers.
sides, yes.
Yeah, both sides. Operators,
Yeah.
employees, three sides. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I used to joke when I was on property working in the front office, we would end up with, you'd get that one guest that is the attorney or works in the field of law somehow, and they're like, yeah, it doesn't work that way, sir.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that happened. I had to teach a hotel outside of Augusta, Georgia. I was there for the Masters, and of course, I was already an hour and a half away. And the guy goes, "Mr. Barth, I'm sorry, we don't have a room for you." And I said, "Oh, you have a room for me."
Yeah. No, you have a room. Like, I have a reservation that's confirmed.
Yeah.
You definitely have a room for me.
Yeah, you have a room.
Yeah. No, it's interesting though. I think we get it. Hotels are just a cultural example of how things evolve over time, but then at the end of the day, it's America too. Everybody's just afraid of being sued for some reason or another at any point in time. And
there is that. Yeah, Bryan, that's true. You know, the other piece of the puzzle, though, I think people need to understand is, with airlines, for instance, there is a specific government agency that's dedicated to the airline business. And arguably, with all the hotel rooms we have in the U.S., there's as much commerce going on with the hotel industry as is in the airline industry. But there is not a government agency dedicated to the hotel business. Now, the owners and franchisees are out there going, shh, don't say that, right? You're going to jinx us. But so what that means is that we're often left to these generic consumer protection laws or none at all. And so you build up these practices over time, and that kind of ends up dictating what's going to happen. So, and so we'll get into that a little bit more, because now there are some specific laws that impact this issue we're going to talk about. But the point being, there's not that general government department that lays down rules and says, this is what happens when this happens. The airlines, and some people argue they don't like the FAA, but quite frankly, if I'm an airline, I like the boundaries. I like the direction. I like to know what I'm able to do and not do. Not everybody sees it that way.
Yeah. Well, and I do think if you're an airline, you like it because there are those moments you want to stand behind the FAA.
For sure.
It helps them.
Good point.
And Sarah Dandish, I don't know if your paths have ever crossed at any point in time. She makes a great point about airlines versus hotels. She's like, airlines are in the service industry. They're there to get you from point A to point B, whereas hotels, we're there to actually provide that hospitality level of service. But I've said for years, if the hotel industry did some of the things that the airlines did, we'd be out of business because everybody would be upset. But at the same time, to your point, there's no regulatory body that's telling us that you can't do certain things. So it's that interesting thing. So now, Stephen, I know you have quite the background, and I find it very intriguing, kind of your story in terms of how you ended up where you're at. But for those of in our audience that are listening and viewing this that don't know you and don't exactly know what you do, what is your like elevator pitch in terms of what is it that you actually do with the hospitality industry? Where do you fit in this big world?
Well, my primary purpose is to create awareness of this concept called hospitality law, right? When I first got asked to teach hospitality law, there was really no such thing. And so there was actually one textbook, but there weren't law firms that had practice areas designated as hotel practice areas or hospitality practice areas. Whereas so we started our conferences, we did the textbook, we've done lots of things to try to create, the website hospitalitylawyer.com. So we try to create this ecosystem around not just energizing lawyers around this concept, but also helping the owners and the operators, the developers, the GMs, et cetera, to understand that there's a lot of law out there that even though it just doesn't say hospitality on it or hotel on it, that you need to be mindful of from a compliance perspective to protect your asset. And, and to operate in a fair, friendly, empathic way. And so I feel pretty good that we're continuing to do that. Plus, I've had 17,000 students.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a big, I go, wow,
that's
too. And I think, and I'm still teaching. I really enjoy it. But, all those, or most of them have gone on to the hotels or restaurants out there or the consulting groups and gone on to do things. So again, that's the primary purpose is doing that. But then we do the conferences, we do the website, we do the newsletters, we do the book. So all of that hopefully creates that ecosystem to generate more and more awareness. Hospitalitylawyer.com is built on the premise that we are match.com for lawyers that want to represent hotels and restaurants and country clubs and things like that. So yeah, it's kind of what we do.
And for anyone out there that says, a lawyer's a lawyer, and it's just contract law. Do we really need somebody that specializes in hotels? What does make the world of hospitality law different than other practices?
Yeah, that's a fair question because at the highest point, the 10,000 foot level, hospitality law encompasses all aspects of the law. Business entities, labor and employment, torts, potential liability claims, right? Personal injury, business succession, estate planning, anything you can think of in the law, it's going to be part of this concept, but it is nuanced because of this business. So for instance, at a hotel, we have the right to lock a guest out. Well, a landlord doesn't have that right. In a hotel, we have the right to enter our guest rooms every day. Well, a landlord typically doesn't have that right. Right. And so those are just a couple of the distinctions that we have. A lot of people don't realize hotels have limited liability statutes like airlines. Airlines, they have a limitation on their baggage liability. Hotels do too, as long as they do a couple of things to be able to take advantage of it. So there's a lot of specific things that are, even though there's a big general area of the law, when you get into the specific aspects of franchising in the hospitality business, third-party management companies, which I know you're very familiar with, and those contracts. And then you've got meeting contracts. And you mentioned attrition earlier. And what half the lawyers, 99% of the lawyers in the space in any space will not understand what attrition means in a meeting contract.
And 100%.
Yeah. So to your point,
I've had to be the one to educate an insurance attorney on what attrition is, because they're like, we don't what is that? Why did you charge them this? I'm like,
right.
This is why I have another attorney. Normally.
Yeah. And so from the industry's perspective, the executives out there listening, you don't want to pay to educate your lawyer about the business. You want to pay them for their time and experience that they bring to you and they should understand your business. And we try to do that with our conferences and the book and our virtual programs and coming on programs like this. Yeah.
Hey, and I think I would say you've been very successful. So it's going well, and it's gotta be like heartwarming for you to know that you've had 17,000 plus students and you've sent people into this world. So
yeah, that is a fun fact. And, I always want to mention this, and I don't want to forget it now. I could have never have done it without the extraordinary support of the Hilton College and all of my teaching assistants that I've had over the years, as well as, the audiovisual folks at the college, the technical support. We're very fortunate. And of course, we are named the Hilton College, and it's the charitable arm mostly of the Hilton family, the Hilton Foundation, that has provided enormous support for our college, our facility, and our students. It doesn't mean the Hilton Corporation doesn't, but not to the extent of the foundation. So I always want to mention that and make sure people understand just how generous that family has been over the years, probably going on $100 million over the last 40, 50 years. Yeah. And it may have exceeded that by now. It's an extraordinary investment in these kids' education. Yeah.
Well, and I've crossed paths with many graduates from the school, and I know that they definitely get a better education there than they do. We won't name other names, but there's other schools out there, but they're not like, I would say, if you're going to go there. So
please don't mention that, because then I'll get the hate mail.
Exactly. And, you don't want to be on the receiving end of that. So.
And while we're on topic of the university, what I'm speaking about today are my thoughts only. They do not reflect the opinions or the philosophy of the university or the college. Thank you for letting me get that in.
Awesome. Well, let's dig into this. So, as the hot topic on everybody's mind, I want to last like 2 weeks. It feels again like it's been forever. It's really only been 2 weeks at this point. Is what I would refer to as the implosion of the Sonder company, as well as their relationship with Marriott International. And going back, for those of you that are listening or watching that don't know the story, back in 2024. Marriott International entered into a licensing agreement with Sonder, which was a tech startup company that offered accommodations through a digital platform globally. And they had real estate holdings that they had master leases on that they were using as part of their inventory. And back in 2024, this relationship began as what's now seen as a last-ditch effort to help save the company by bringing them into the Marriott system so that they could be marketed as Sonder by Marriott Bonvoy. About 2 weeks ago, on a Sunday, Marriott International did a rare thing and released a press release on a Sunday, which typically is not something we see from Marriott, of all companies, that their license agreement was coming to an end effective immediately. And then within about 12 hours later, there was a release from Sonder letting everyone know that in the United States, they were going into bankruptcy, and then they would be starting insolvency procedures in all the global markets that they work in, which then prompted communications to guests globally that were in their facilities that they had to vacate, in most cases by 12 noon the following day, leaving a lot of people in the lurch and a lot of calls going into the Marriott Customer Care Center. As anything is, the PR, the press releases and the PR that's been done around this from, I would say mostly on Marriott's side. Sonder's done a little bit of communication on it, was a little clunky. And I think the biggest piece of this is they weren't really there was a lot of answers with non-answers. And then biggest thing, a lot of guests were left. They had prepaid in many cases, and they're sitting out there in places like Italy and London with not sure where to go and feeling like they weren't getting much help from Marriott. But Marriott terminated the agreement, Stephen, citing a default. Legally speaking, what does a default usually look like in a license agreement like this? And is it common for it to happen so abruptly with no type of a cure period like it did in this case?
Let me take the first part, which is, what can cause a default? Now, I haven't seen the agreement between Sonder and Marriott, so with that as a foundation, typically though, Bryan, as you know, in any type of licensing arrangement, brand licenses the franchisee. This is not much different than that, right? And so I'm sure that Marriott has in the agreement quality standards, and I'm also certain that there is the financial component to it as well. So it's most likely one of those two. What I've seen so far leads me to believe it's most likely the latter, the financial. In other words, the fees that Sonder was supposed to pay Marriott for getting these reservations to them, which quite frankly, at the time it happened and they made the deal, I thought it was genius for Sonder. To be able to, oh man, goodness gracious, to be able to open that door for you. But most likely they did not live up to the financial responsibilities under the agreement, again, without having seen the agreement. And I don't know what's gone on. But to your second point about, is there a ramp up to these things? Listen, knowing Marriott the way I do, the folks that work there, my experience is they always try to look at things from a positive, successful outcome point of view. But at the end of the day, they're in business. They have shareholders they have to respond to and employees, right, that depend on them. And so I feel relatively certain that there was significant negotiations around this and trying to do anything they could to figure out a way to make this work. And also probably giving some deadlines to Sonder and saying, hey, you got to do this by this. Or finally, you get to the point where, all right, this is not going to happen and you have to set a boundary. And so I feel like that's probably what happened. When it happens in the travel business, if a tour implodes or something like this implodes, it is exacerbated. If there's got to be a recall of a bed, all right, we can manage that. We can go get another bed. But, you've paid this money. Oftentimes you put it on your credit card. You've taken time off your workplace and now you're stuck.
Right.
And as well as I do with this revenue yield management, the price is now, if you're looking for a room tonight, you're getting the worst price ever. And
it may cost you as much as your whole stay was when you booked the original one.
Such a good point. Yes. Yeah. And so it just exacerbates the emotional turmoil. So that's my best perspective on what happened. But I do want to say that, again, my perspective also knowing the Marriott folks the way I do is that, and I don't know the Sonder folks, they could, genuinely, they could have worked, and I'm sure they did. This was their baby. This was their business. They're trying to figure out a solution. But when Marriott said no more, that turned off the pipeline that Sonder was probably relying upon. So they were already probably facing financial difficulties. Now you turn off that reservation pipeline. That probably forced them into bankruptcy. And that's when the landlords most likely said, everybody's got to go. And that's the dominoes that I think probably happened. And unfortunately, it's the guest who bears the brunt and the impact. And we'll talk more about that in a minute.
Right. No, and I think, it is interesting because a lot of people that I've read pieces online through different outlets and interviews they've done, and everyone's been like, it is just so sudden. It's so sudden. And to your point, I've been in this industry long enough and then working, especially like we've had many hotels and different projects with Marriott as well, that typically those defaults that occur, even financial defaults, they're not typically something that it's an overnight situation where it's like, well, you didn't pay your bill, so tomorrow we're going to cut you off. There is usually some type of cure period or notice. I would say it's interesting looking at it from the outside perspective, and especially now that Sonder's they're winding down because of their bankruptcy filing. It did seem like, from a media perspective, it was both companies were trying to save their own reputations at the same time. But I do think and I hopefully will learn this one day, it makes me wonder if the only reason why Marriott issued a Sunday press release, which again, historically has not ever happened, is that they may have found out over the weekend that Sonder would be filing for bankruptcy on Monday, which would have caused landlords for those buildings that they had, like it was going to happen. And I do think that Marriott may have acted, on a Sunday to get ahead of it, knowing that everything was going to implode the following day, which then of course gave Sonder the ability to do a press release and say, well, it was the Marriott integration and it was that caused this. But there's a lot of things, right, we don't know. So much that we just don't know, that we don't see, that we probably won't ever know until later. With that, and as you mentioned, the guests do bear the burden with this. Like, that's the biggest piece here is you've got, thousands of people across the globe that, bear the collateral damage in this contractual mess. But we did see guests receiving emails from Marriott as well as notices from Sonder letting them know that they had to vacate within 24 hours or less. From a legal standpoint, do you feel like this crosses a line from a contract dispute into an unfair or deceptive trade practice, or is it just an unfortunate outcome of the situation?
Yeah, it depends on the party you're talking about. I don't see an unfair, deceptive practice on Marriott's part. It would be difficult, I think, to argue that Sonder was in that lane as well. Like I said, I feel confident they were doing everything they could to generate revenue to keep the ship afloat. And, you mentioned that tech integration issue. That just may have become insurmountable. Right. And they just couldn't get the volume. Maybe, I don't know, but maybe they just couldn't get the volume of reservations they projected. And maybe they grew too quickly. Maybe they didn't have, seed funding anymore, funding capability. So you never know. And somebody will write a story about this when it's all said and done, and we can look back and see. But no, I'm not. I think it is a contractual mess, like you said. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's a deceptive type of situation. Plus, Brian, I think it's important for the listeners to know is that typically in contractual areas, and a reservation agreement is a contract. You and I have talked about that. But typically it would be rare for a court to award what we call extra contractual damages or remedies. So for the emotional turmoil that a guest suffered, or for the time it took to rebook, or because of the difference in the cost, potentially, because you typically in contract, you typically want to make the non-breaching party whole. So there could be some of that, but the emotional turmoil and the time, I don't think courts are going to be receptive to those arguments. And of course, it's going to depend on the terms and conditions as well on the booking platform, that where the person made that. And that's going to be a big issue for everybody.
Right. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like we also could put this in the standpoint of this would be no different. Essentially, you and I haven't obviously seen the license agreement. We don't really know what the full agreement was. But more than likely, this was very similar to a franchise agreement with a hotel owner in any hotel across the country or the globe, where the hotel owner could potentially become financially insolvent and the hotel closes immediately because it's going back to the bank, or it's seized, or what have you. But those don't get covered as much, right? Because it's usually a very regional thing, and it only affects a couple. It may affect 50 or 60 people immediately, whereas this was a much larger thing. And I think for me, that's the one thing is interesting, how this became such a large thing overnight. But I think it was that volume where it's, where I have seen this happen, and I think you've probably seen it too, where a hotel just closes tomorrow, leaving like everybody out. Nobody knows what's going on.
That's right. Sadly, it does happen. Or the cruise ship never leaves the port, or or that tour nobody meets you at the tour destination. Yeah,
right.
It's sad, and it does happen. Look, travel businesses, hotel businesses, technology businesses, all businesses have the potential to fail. And when consumers do business with a business, they are taking the risk that that business is going to deliver the goods, product, services that they promise to deliver. And you and I both know it does not always happen that way. But that's why it becomes so important for people that are traveling to really consider travel insurance, which could definitely help with a situation like this. And if somebody's out there listening that was involved in this, you could also look potentially at your homeowner's insurance, your renter's policy, maybe even your auto insurance sometimes, or your credit card insurance for sure,
That's
depending on the card you put it on. And so, but I would not give up until I've exhausted all of those. I think the odds are slim on your homeowners and your auto, but maybe your renters, certainly your credit card insurance, but especially if you had a travel insurance policy for those people impacted by it, I would definitely start there, and then the credit card is the second priority. Yeah.
Right. And even if you think you have a credit card that doesn't have any travel perks, I think sometimes people would be surprised that there actually are things included. If you look at your card member agreement, there actually is some coverage. Now, do you think that some of the guest reaction we've seen in the news and that's been reported on, do you think some of it is this breakdown of what the consumer understands of the franchise model in terms of, there's not a lot of people look at a building that has the word Marriott or Hilton or, Holiday Inn plastered across the front, and their immediate thought is, well, that is the company that owns it, and that's who I'm doing business with, which is not the case. And I always use McDonald's as the best example when I'm explaining how hotels work. McDonald's doesn't own and operate every single location that you see, just like Hilton doesn't own and operate every location that they have. Do you think that is just do you think some of this reaction is just a lack of consumer knowledge in that area, where just because a sign says XYZ, that doesn't mean XYZ is responsible?
I think you're exactly right about that. I think people would be surprised to learn that Marriott, I think the last time I looked, probably only owns 50 hotels, maybe owns and leases. They might manage another 2,000.
Right. I think the number now is actually even fewer than 50 now. Yeah, but that definitely manages, it's over 2,000 right now.
Out of their 9,000 hotels, right? Hilton is probably, because everybody, IHG, Hilton, not picking on Marriott, Choice, Wyndham, Best Western, it's kind of a different model because it's more of a membership model. But nevertheless, they're all asset light. And that's the industry term we use to say that they have sold off all their real estate for the benefit of their shareholders. And now they're just really technology companies that are selling franchises, right? And they make their money off franchises. And quite frankly, they make a whole lot of money off credit card fees as well. Those co-branded cards, airlines, I read somewhere they make like 50% of their revenue off these credit card fees. I mean, it's an enormous business. And so, so back to your point though, no, the general public does not know that. And you being a hotel management company, or, in your spare time, that typically a hotel management company will put a small sign at the front desk that says, it's Marriott on the cover, Hilton on the cover, on the flag, what we call the sign for those of you not in the business, but it's got a little sign at the front desk that says this property is owned by so-and-so and managed by Aimbridge or whoever it is.
Right.
And just to pick the largest one in the But the public doesn't know that. And, but to be fair though, the public doesn't also know that you might have 300 guests in your hotel overnight and you probably only have one or two employees working overnight at that hotel. So, to the discussion we had earlier about there's not government standards that have to be, end up with these internal industry standards and practices. To your point, the public does not know that. So when they see Marriott, and you saw the reaction, Marriott did that, Marriott did that. Marriott didn't do this to them, right? Sonder basically did it, and we can talk about Marriott's role, but that is, I think you're exactly right. But look, when it's all said and done, there's two sides of that sword. If I'm the franchisor, the brand, the Hilton, the Marriott, I want people to think they're doing business with Hilton and Marriott, right? But the public needs to understand you're not dealing with that entire resource capability when you go stay at a licensed property or franchise property.
Right. Yeah, it's not the same. And the franchisor, that's Marriott, Hilton, IHG, BWH, whomever, doesn't. While they have a lot of control, over what's happening on location. They have no control over what's
Yeah,
happening on location.
and they make it clear. Yeah,
Yeah,
they don't want to have day to day control. They're going to
right,
establish some quality standards, linens, food and
right.
beverage. But when it comes to legal safety and security, except maybe fire safety, they're good at that, I think. But
Yeah,
they're going to push back and have the owner make these day to day decisions about employment and other safety and security issues.
right.
And that, listen, that's a very challenging debate in the United States, and it's one we're not going to solve today.
So in this case, you actually have three people involved because you got Marriott as the
Oh yeah,
licensor, you
yeah,
got Sonder as the licensee, and then you have a building owner that was the landlord that was leasing, was the lessor to Sonder, and then Sonder is the leasee. Um, in just knowing how we know that license agreements typically work with the hotel business, I would assume really the landlord and the lessor in this situation really bears no burden in this downfall of Sonder as it sits, because at that point it's just they didn't pay their rent or whatever the contractual terms are, correct? Like,
I think that's probably right. I would be surprised if the landlords bear any responsibility. Again, it's going to depend on the agreements. There's going to be an enterprise. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on the legal stuff, but there could be an enterprising lawyer out there that might argue that the guest was a third party beneficiary of the contract between Sonder and the landlord. But I don't. I doubt that would get you very far. It would be a creative argument, but the Chapter 7, the liquidation is and that automatic stay is probably going to stop a whole lot of stuff that's going on here. What that means is that once the federal bankruptcy judge enters that stay, that means that nothing can happen.
mm-hmm.
The only thing that gets there, you can't bring a lawsuit, you can't file a plea, you can't file a motion, you can't do anything. You can't, but the debtor can't spend any money either. And so everything has to come before the judge. And these bankruptcy judges are good and organized and strict, and you do not want to violate a stay and go before a federal bankruptcy judge. So, I think and that's one of the reasons you file bankruptcy, is so you're not having to respond to 1,000 different lawsuits all over the country, and that's, I'm sure, what happened. Plus, they were probably, sounds like they were out of money because as you pointed out, they have these enormous master leases, and then they lost a big revenue stream.
Right. Yeah, and see, I've only seen one offer from Sonder. There were many others, but I know if that was their typical thing, just looking in terms of how the business, the market's not been that great this year. For hotels, them being on a hotel platform, it makes me wonder, okay, was your strategy sound, knowing that the market could go into some sort of, it could recede at some point, and you still have, because they still had to make those rent payments even if they didn't have those units.
They did. And that's the distinguishing feature between them and Airbnb. Airbnb doesn't have that monthly, they only pay when somebody rents. Right, to their owners. But Sonder took a different approach, and it doesn't appear like it worked very well.
Yeah. Which is funny for me. Like I've always been told, don't put a hotel on a ground lease. A ground lease is like the death nail for most hotels, just because if the economy goes into recession, a lot of times you can't afford to pay the ground lease. And this was like, not only it wasn't even just the ground that you're releasing, you literally releasing everything that was on the property. Yeah. So now, we did talk about this before we got on, but the traditional innkeeper's duty or innkeeper liability that most states and jurisdictions require of hotels, would that typically, and I'll be honest, it's been a while since I've read most of them, but typically those are only talking about the contents or in like your belongings that are within the hotel room and that sort of thing. But does the innkeeper's duty, would anything out of that ever apply to a situation like this? Or is that are those muddy waters, or is it really not something that it wouldn't even be something that it would be entertained in this type of a situation?
Well, I think if you look at Marriott's response, I think Marriott is doing the best they can to address the customers that booked through Marriott sites.
Right.
And that I think they've probably decided that's their legal responsibility. Right. And
Right.
I think that's a fair, I don't know again, what the internal machinations were or what they were thinking, but that would be my best guess. And then the line of demarcation was if you book through a third party site, right? We don't have a legal responsibility there because there's a concept in the law called privity, right? Privity is we don't have a relationship, right? You booked through booking.com. Yeah, it has our name on it, but you and I never did business together. Right. And so Marriott's probably taken the position, I think, that, we don't have a legal responsibility to those people that book through the third party. At least that's the way it appears in the in press releases and the emails that I've seen. But having said that, Bryan, I commend Marriott because what I saw them do, and I assume they're following through, is that hey, even though you book through a third party, we can't give you a refund. You need to speak to Sonder or the third party booking unit, which is who they have the customer has a relationship with.
Right.
But they went on to say, but we will try to facilitate that. We will try to support you in that. I don't think they had to do that. I think that's part of their value proposition that they felt like they wanted to, and to try to mitigate whatever pain that customers and potential Bonvoy members might be going through. And look, I don't think that's any small thing, honestly. Don't take this the wrong way, but if Bryan Fish and Stephen Barth call booking.com and say, hey, you owe us money because Sonder went belly up, booking.com is going to go, right, get in line, dude.
Yeah,
but
they're not going
to. Yeah. But if Marriott sends a note and says, hey, here are these people that are in this situation, we would greatly appreciate it as a professional courtesy if you would give them some special consideration or move in the front of the line. You know what? To me, that's a big deal. And I get a lot of people are not going to appreciate it this way, but I kind of saw it as a rather magnanimous gesture on their behalf, trying to make the best out of, as you know, is just a tragic situation for people. Yeah.
No, and I agree because because if it's one person calling, the reality, and then who you would call wouldn't even be like the person that would even be able to make that happen. Whereas, given the fact that Marriott does have these large agreements, any of the franchises have these large agreements with those companies, they have a little bit more weight to push around than, a Stephen Barth or a Bryan Fish ever would have. So
you can emphasize that. Yes, they do.
Yeah, it is what it is, which goes to the reason why, it's good to do business. Even in the franchise world, it's good to do business with a company that is well.
Bryan, to that point, and listen, that's a very crucial point to make to your listeners or to the general public out there is when you're entering into contracts for things like this, you've got a couple of choices. We used to call it in law school a bundle of sticks. That's all of our property professors would say. Well, if you do this, you get if you buy, you get this bundle of sticks. If you rent, you only get this many sticks in the bundle, right? And it's the same thing here. If you book through Marriott, you get the whole bundle of sticks, right? You get the points, you get typically overbooking protection, you get bonus, you get status. If you book through a third party, you probably don't get all of those sticks. Right. And so you're getting a better price often, not always, but often, but you're giving up some value that, you would get if you book through directly. And I think that's an important point for people to understand. And look, the other piece that we mentioned insurance earlier, if you don't buy insurance, essentially, then you are self-insuring. right? You are saying, well, if something goes wrong, I can handle it. I've got the money to get myself back, to rebook or do something like that. If you don't have that capability, the best practice is to get travel insurance or make sure your credit card has insurance to cover something like that.
Right.
Unfortunately, in my opinion, the U.S., as I mentioned earlier, doesn't have a government oversight of the lodging industry. I'm not suggesting, anyway,
We're not suggesting that. Yeah.
Yeah, but what I am suggesting is that I'm a big believer in consumer protection laws. I think they're good for everybody and the economy, generally speaking. And of course, businesses don't always see it that way. But we do not have strong consumer protection, particularly right now under this current administration. And so people need to recognize that the risk of loss for the consumer is probably at its highest point in the last 30 or 40 years. So you're self-insuring or you're buying insurance or you're reducing your risk by booking directly with the provider, the name brand, the Marriott, the Hilton, the IHG.
Right. Yeah. But again, even if you do book directly, they're like in this case, they're still going to help the franchises or the parent companies going to still help you as much as they can, but they're also not the ones receiving the money either, because those payments are also happening at the licensee level as opposed to the licensor level. So they don't even have those funds to refund you, which kind of brings me to my next point. One of the things that, and I think you mentioned this, Marriott customer care has been reported to have been referring some guests, which is interesting the way the guests have communicated it out that they're unhappy about. But in cases where Marriott's not able to assist the guests by relocating them or using any of the bundles of sticks that they have at their disposal, they've been advising the guests to simply just dispute the credit card charges with their credit card company. Because in Sonder's case, which is a unique case versus most of the other brands within the family and really any of the franchises, most Sonder stays were all paid for 100% upfront at the point of check-in on the Sonder app, and you are paying Sonder directly. So, Marriott, I think it's important for consumers to understand you may have prepaid Sonder, but that money went to Sonder. It's not sitting in a bucket at Marriott's headquarters in Bethesda waiting for somebody to ask for it. It just simply doesn't exist. And there's been some people, I've seen some TikTok videos and things on Instagram where people are ranting and raving, well, they should just give me my money back. I know the answer to this question, but I feel like I need you to validate the answer to this question. Is it sound legal advice for the brand to give people to say, hey, like we can't make this right through all these other things. If these don't solve the problem, we really just suggest that you dispute this with your credit card company because maybe they can help you. My perspective is that logically would be the next step because there really is no one for that consumer to call at this point. But is that just Marriott or whomever putting the issue over to the credit card company, or in the workflow of this crisis, is that really the next logical step to go to?
Yeah, just to be clear, as we've discussed, we're not giving legal advice.
Exactly, yes.
But just some suggestions and maybe a little education. Yeah. But no, I don't think it's Marriott passing the buck. I think, to your point, I think it's Marriott trying to offer a remedy to people that perhaps they haven't thought about. Now, I don't know how the stay would impact the credit card company's decision as to whether or not to refund or block a charge or dispute a charge, especially if they've already given that money to Sonder, right? And those clearings with digital, that happens pretty quickly these days. Yeah. So you just don't know what that's going to look like. I see it as Marriott trying to, in good faith, make a suggestion to guests to try to help them recover financially.
Right. No, and that's how I look at it too. It's because I've been through this situation when we, like with hotels that have had some sort of a disaster happen or something where it's closed down, and it's again the brand is left at in a very precarious position because, again, they don't have a bucket of money they can just hand out. And, if the hotel owner doesn't have the money, there's all these moving parts, which again don't necessarily doesn't make the consumer happy, but at the same time, I think it is one more resource that they could go to.
Yeah, Bryan, real quick, this is a very complex set of circumstances.
Oh yeah.
You've got the agreement between Sonder and Marriott. You've got the agreements between Sonder and the landlords. You've got the terms and conditions on all of the websites involved, right? The booking websites. You've got laws in 50 different states that I promise you are all different. We talked at the top of the hour, even though there's not a federal legal structure around hotels, there are lots of statutory laws around hotels, and in some states around travel and tourism and remedies and consumer protections. And so, look, this is very complex. And but when you get down to the individual person that lost the money, it's very simple. Show me my money.
Right.
Give me what I paid for. And you have to appreciate the yin and the yang, but it's so sad for them, and everybody knows it. And I'll guarantee you, and I hope your listeners appreciate the fact, I'll bet Marriott was all hands on deck, burning the midnight oil, trying to figure out how to mitigate the impact this had, not just on their folks, but on any people that got caught up in this trap. That if you look at their value statements, if you look at the way they conducted themselves over the years, they've got a good compass, in my opinion. Is it perfect? No.
No. And I think that's the thing. The message I would want people to walk away with is it perfect? No. Mm-mm. And not just Marriott. I think all the hotel franchisors try to do the best that they can, but this is where the system that we've built over the last 20 years in the hotel industry is at. Because to your point, a lot of these things are almost built like a game of Jenga, where there's all these blocks. There's all these blocks put together, and once all the hotel companies did start selling their assets off to become asset light, they did. And you mentioned this, and this is a perfect statement because it's so true these days. These hotel companies, these franchisers, they are tech companies or marketing companies at this point. They do the best they can in crises, but they're not the surgeon that's going to fix you and make you whole again when you walk out. And I think this was like I mentioned at the beginning, it's just very simple to, I relate it to a singular hotel going out of business overnight. This was just a very, again, complex set of circumstances where you had a global brand, and you're absolutely right. And I know some folks over there at Marriott, and I know that this is obviously not what they wanted to have happen. I mean, this was supposed to be a pretty lucrative deal for them too. Mm-hmm. And look where it ran it out. So, it's going to be interesting though to see where this leads. Over the course of the next, I don't think we're going to hear much about the next couple months, but I have a feeling in about 12 months we'll hit, this is going to actually bubble up. From your experience, do you think that we're going to see a massive, from a guest, I'll ask you about landlords in a minute, but on a guest perspective, do you think that we'll really see much litigation come of this, or do you think it's going to be something where it's really just people are unhappy because of the set of circumstances and they kind of get over it? I mean, I can't imagine that there's going to be a lot of people that band together for any type of class suit in regards to this, just because of the complexity of it.
Yeah. A lot of their remedies are going to be dictated by the terms and conditions.
Right.
And often there's not going to be enough money for somebody to pursue it. But if somebody does pursue it, it's probably going to be a judge or a lawyer.
Yeah, that happened to be part of the group that got affected. I mean, hey, it's fair. That's fair. That's a fair statement.
They have a unique set of
tools at their benefit. Yeah, right.
There you go. Yeah.
Now for people that are listening that they would want to get involved in a situation like this, like a license agreement like this one that Marriott was in with Sonder, do you have any suggestions or anything that you would say to the person that says, hey, I want to lease my building out to an operator and give them full control and make me a monthly lease payment for the next 3 to 5 years? Is there something that, like, I know that my advice is always find an attorney. I think when you and I did you moderated a panel when I was on earlier this year, and I don't even remember the number of times everybody in the panel said, it's always best to go. It's worth paying an attorney for these things. Is there any advice you would give owners of assets like this where you're going to have somebody lease it out and operate it in this manner to protect yourself? Because again, one thing people aren't talking about are all the hundreds of buildings that had leases on them that those owners are not getting payments on.
No, they're not. And just again, to be clear, we're not giving advice. I'm going to make a suggestion. Yeah. But, the suggestion, Bryan, is just like, what's that old adage? Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Right.
And that's basically what those landlords are doing. And look, to be fair to those folks, that's hard money to turn down. You're going to get 100% occupancy. Maybe it's a discounted rate for the next 3 to 5 years. Holy cow. That would be so difficult to turn down. But the risk is this. This is the poster child for the risk that you're taking. And then people argue, well, I had an indemnification agreement from Sonder, or that is the most overused term, indemnification, and it's only as good as the money is behind it. It's really basically a promise to make somebody whole, but if there's no money to make somebody whole, then it doesn't do any good. So the suggestions I would
water out of a rock.
There you go. And so the suggestions are, look, I get the allure, but man, you put all your eggs in one basket, there's the risk. I think a lot of people I know, as we get older, I'm hopeful. In my case, it took me way too long to get this, but we got to ask ourselves, what can go wrong, right? Before making decisions. We all see the upside's pretty easy to see, but it's putting yourself in that situation with this potential downside and saying, can I handle this if this happens? And man, I don't know many landlords that can sustain a blow like this, because now they have to start from scratch and re-rent their properties and try to get occupancy up in their apartments and get that cash flow. And, it's hard to go from 1 to 100 overnight.
Right.
Yeah.
Which would have made those deals palatable to begin with, as you said. Was a great, and my non-advice advice is, if it seems too good to be true, you should do a little bit more due diligence.
Well, that's true. And then back to the
anything, right?
Yeah. It's all about the indemnification. It's all about the financial wherewithal of the company you're doing business with. Yeah. So, and the guarantees, right? Those guarantees are only as good as the person behind them and the money behind them. And so we rely, I've got a guarantee. I've got an indemnification. But you've got to have money behind those for them to have value.
Right. Well, I've got a few minutes left with you, and I think let's put Marriott and Sonder behind us, because you and I are not going to be able to solve that problem overnight.
We're not.
For sure.
Yeah.
But I appreciate your perspective on it, because it's like I said, it's been one of the top things that everybody's been talking about lately, and it's But I do think it's an interesting case study for how the future runs, and I think it could be a precedent-setting thing in terms of how franchisors engage with franchisees on this type of thing in the future.
It could be, and I'm hopeful, and I hope your audience and anybody that was involved, negatively impacted, they heard our empathy for what they're gone through and going through. But I'm also hopeful, Bryan, that it's kind of a wake-up call to the consumer, to take some of the steps we talked about, whether it's the insurance or booking direct, or understanding just a better understanding of the risk they are taking. Yeah.
If you're going to accept the risk, at least know what the risk is.
There you go. That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
And don't just click the buttons on the page. You actually read what you're. But so, like, in the world of hospitality law, I think there's all sorts of owners in this world, right? Like, we have all sorts of people in this business, and I'm sure you've seen all sorts of different things. But what do you see right now for owners and operators that you would consider to be as we come to the end of 2025? Actually, like, What do you feel like in our business right now are like the three like legal minefields that you would hope that people moving into 2026 need to be aware of, or that or they don't even need to be minefields. Maybe it's just the most common mistakes you've been seeing people make lately that you're like, stop doing this. Like, just, you need to do X, Y, Z.
The hotel, from the hotel owner's perspective
From
and
the hotel
operator's
owner's perspective
perspective.
and the operators. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the top thing in my book would be devoting more time to hiring people, the right people for the right job, training and educating those people consistently, but not just about checking in a guest and checking out a guest, Bryan, but also about the fundamental legal safety and security aspects of running a hotel. As an example, we don't give out a key without an ID.
Right.
Right. I can't tell you how many times I get phone calls where somebody, thankfully, often nobody was hurt, but somebody busted into a room that was occupied because the front desk person gave them a key. Right. We just can't. Your master key control system, really, that's what it gets down to.
Right.
Has to be complied with diligently. But today people, given the situation, the turmoil in labor markets, is that if they can breathe, they're qualified. And it just can't be that way. We've got to do some background checks for people that are going to have access to rooms. We've got to do some drug testing. We have to do we have to find better people. The other thing I think is responding to, or another thing I think training is important in terms of, if somebody says call 911, you got to call 911. You don't go check it out first. You don't go administer training. You get professional help on the way. Then you go check it out. Let's see. I think the next item is just going to be the human trafficking situation. It's so tragic, and the litigation is so intense. I think innkeepers really need to understand their responsibility there of reasonable care, and that really comes from training, being on the lookout, and having your entire team, just building a culture of compliance. And that's part of, I suggest that innkeepers get into their guest rooms every single day, even if it's just to change the trash bag. I think that will, and the hospitality security folks that I work with, they agree that, background checks and getting into our guest rooms, those are things we can do. And then, the last thing is probably cyber security. And to your point, you've got this individual owner. You don't have this big resource and all these tech people. And so you're putting this incredible burden for them to keep this information private. And it's a significant burden on them. And so I think we could do better with that, and I think that's a minefield, to use your word.
I was going to say, I'm glad you brought that up, because to me that is a big minefield right now, because and I literally was just at an event this week and talked about this with several people. If you're a franchisee of a large franchisor, there is a good population within the business that thinks, well, the franchisor's taking care of all these things.
Nah.
But to our earlier conversation, no. Because if there's a data breach and it's found to come through your local system, you are the first one that's going to get thrown out under the bus in terms of, you made this, you didn't do all these things. They provide some technology that they make you use, but it's not their job to secure that technology on your site. So,
and it's done at that local level. It's you, the one that took the payment card information, right? You agreed to the standards when you agreed to accept the cards, the PCI DSS. Right. And so you're right. That's a scenario that plays out. But I think the other side of that is that the minefield is not having the right insurance.
And I was going to say that, it's cyber coverage has been getting offered to people, and it's, if your broker or your agent is saying, hey, I think you should take this, you need to have the conversation. It actually is worth the money. I've heard a lot of people say, well, but I don't need it because I've never had something happen. Well, your hotel has also never burned to the ground, and you still have the building is insured. So
That's the kiss of death. And your hotel has
right,
never burned to the ground, but you still have fire drills.
right,
Right. And so, yeah, so
yeah,
we do that. Yes. And, the other, and the amount of coverage you need, you really need a broker, not just a lawyer that understands your business. You need
right.
an insurance broker that understands your business so they know the different coverages for if you're selling alcohol, dram shop
Hmm.
liability, food and beverage, right? Cyber. There are lots of things out there that are unique, can be unique to this industry that people need to know about for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a lot about that for sure.
yeah, no, absolutely. And then to
Oh,
end
one
off,
other
if
thing,
it,
Brian,
oh
real
yeah,
quick, on the
yeah,
insurance side, EPLI, Employment
oh
Practices
yes,
Liability Insurance. It's usually not very expensive if you tag it on to your general liability, and then that covers. So for your audience that doesn't know, that covers actions if your employees harass somebody or discriminate against somebody, or they do something that is outside the context of standards of care in the industry. And you need that insurance, if nothing else, to get your defense paid for.
right.
And so I encourage you to explore EPLI, Employment Practices Liability Insurance, because that can really save your bacon in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. Sorry, I interrupted you on your last
No,
thought.
no, I'm glad you said that because that's actually, I mean, I personally have had to use that coverage in the past, and it's one of the cheaper policies that gets bundled in with everything else you're doing, but it
Yeah.
can be the one that really saves you at the end of the day.
Oh, for
And,
sure.
I think the other piece that I would add to that is just when you're doing the insurance, make sure that because some of us have like very complicated legal structures for the ownership of our assets
Yeah.
and management, make sure you're disclosing all those legal entities to the insurance agent so that you can make sure everything's covered so you don't end up with a surprise when something does happen. So,
That's a very good point.
and then to end off, because I'm sure you have a lot of these, but pick one. If there's one legal myth that you've heard for years from hospitality professionals and you hear them repeated all the time and it makes you cringe every time you hear it, what is it?
Probably the top one, because I work in this space a lot and I
Hmm.
see the horrible consequences it has when we don't do this right. It's that hotels that sell alcohol invariably think that they don't need to worry about selling alcohol responsibly because the people that are drinking at the hotel or in the bar are just going to go up to their room and sleep it off. And they're not going to get in their car and drive away. And I call that's a myth. And I call it stinking thinking. Because number one,
Okay.
it ignores the fact that the excessive consumption of alcohol is not doesn't just impact drinking and driving. It impacts decision making. It higher slips, trips and falls, drownings, violence, sexual assaults. The list goes on when there's too much alcohol served. A lot of people drive to hotels to drink, right? And then they
Right.
drive away. And so I wish hotels would really think differently and recognize that they have anybody that's a provider of alcohol has a responsibility to serve alcohol responsibly.
I'm glad it's interesting. I'm glad that's number one on your list because it's so stinking
Yeah.
true. Because it's to your and having been on property, having managed on property and do all these
Yeah.
things. The idea is, well, they're just going to go sleep it off, and maybe they aren't going to go drive, but they have access a lot of times to a vehicle. And maybe they weren't thinking of going and driving, but then when your bar closes and they want to go find something else that's open, it just snowballs from there. As a recovering hotel general manager, front office manager, operator, it's not every, but I would say a good 90% of the bad situations that I would have to deal with that occurred between guests or with a guest on property, alcohol was always involved. And I mean, I don't want to say that we overserved them or we could, but the question always came up: could we have done a better job at identifying, if this guest was going to potentially be an issue to themselves or others? Well, Stephen, I know that we could do like an 8-hour show with you. Just because I find my dinner in New Orleans with you was like one of the best things I did this year, just because I was like, this guy, he just gets it from a different perspective and like makes you think about what you're doing. And I just love it. So I'm glad that you're in this business. I'm glad that you're teaching others. And I don't think this will be the last time. I think we'll have you back again for sure.
Well, I would be honored to come back, and that's high praise. Thank you kindly, Bryan. It was a pleasure having dinner with you, and I learned a lot from you on that panel as well. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, and hopefully we'll get to do it again soon, and then hopefully I'll see you in Houston at some point. I'll be down there a little bit more this next year for some projects, so it'll be good. But so if any of the viewers or listeners want to find you, where would be the best place to find Stephen Barth?
Yeah, so a couple of places. You can go to hospitalitylawyer.com and you can just send a general message through there. There's a contact button, or you can, and that'll reach me, or you can go to stephenbarth.com and Stevens with a PH, and you can find my contact information there. And feel free to send me an email or just give me a call on my cell or text me. That seems to be the way of the world today. So.
And he's a good texter. He's a very good texter.
I do try to respond promptly, unless it's a scam. But if I'm one of your viewers, highly, I'm happy to respond.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. This has been a pleasure, and we'll see you again soon. And everyone else, don't forget to check out this Friday's episode of The Checkout, and we will be back again next week with another good long format interview. And Stephen, again, one more time, thank you so much. Be sure to check him out at hospitalitylawyer.com, and have a great week.
This episode of Check In with Bryan is a production of RH Media Productions, hosted by Bryan Fish, executive producer Tyler Alexander, marketing support provided by Sunny Templar. Thanks for checking in. Be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss this week's Friday Checkout coming this Friday at 9 a.m. Eastern. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Reliance Hospitality Global Incorporated or any of its affiliates, partners, or subsidiaries. All content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional or legal advice.